Hi, it's Jo here from Minerva, and today I'm here to help beginners choose all the equipment they might need for a basic sewing kit. I'm wearing a Tilly and the Buttons Matilde blouse in a really soft crepe today. Just show you there, look. It's got a really nice feel, this fabric, really drapes well, but those seams are pressed, and even when I wash this, I don't have to repress those pleats. They just hang really nicely once they've been steam pressed. Has bracelet length sleeves, and it has buttons down the back. It's a bit of an intermediate sew. It's a little bit more tricky. It has facings, it has cuffs, it has a yoke line here and pleats. It can be really difficult to choose your first sewing kit, but today I'm going to show you all the things that would really get you started and the essential things that you need to get sewing. Obviously you're going to need a pair of scissors, some really good ones. I'm going to show you some of those, some pins, and a tape measure and some measuring equipment and something for marking out. And you've got to choose from your budget which things you want to spend a bit more money on and which things you're going to have a go at and see if you like them or not, because you might want to upgrade a little bit when you've got better at sewing. It might be a good idea to join the Minerva club, because if you're starting out in sewing and you're going to be investing in your new kit, if you're in the Minerva club, then you can get a discount. So it's a good time, if you're about to start out, to get all your kit together with a discount. So here's the sewing kit that I've chosen. There's some Janome scissors. That's a big pair for cutting out fabric and a small pair for snipping and smaller tasks. A clover and picker, really good sharp one. A tape measure, that's from Prim. A sewing gauge, which is a little tool, this one here. It's a little add-on really, but it's really great for having as a tabletop tool, so you're not flapping a tape measure around when you just want to measure something small. Some pins and a really great marking tool set, something you buy once and it lasts ages and it really works well. So I folded my fabric in half and I'm about to cut out, so I'll just remind you of a few cutting tips. I'm really trying to find the grain line because I've got a grain arrow here, which means the grain has to run straight then. Because this is a pair of trousers, I'll get a twisted leg seam if I don't have that grain line absolutely straight. The pattern of the fabric has got apples on it, so I'm using the pattern to follow the grain line. So there's an apple with some pips there, and it's the same there, and it's the same there. So here, here and here, I know I've got the grain line, and I'm going to use my glass head pins, which I showed you. They're really sharp. They're going through 2 layers of quite thick cotton, but they're just holding the fabric in the grain line. So you might think pins are just for sort of attaching your paper pattern to the fabric, but they're also holding all sorts of things. So along the edge here, where I folded my fabric in half, I've used the pins to hold my halfway line there so that I don't get a twist in fabric as I'm adding my pattern. So pins here are holding all those apple pips in a straight line. That's helped me to find my really straight grain line for the front of my trousers. And then I can use the rest of the pins to pin the rest of the fabric to the paper pattern. Of course, it's at this point that you would lengthen or shorten the pattern on the lengthen and shorten line here, but I'm okay for that on these. So I'm just going to pin it all together and then have a go with my scissors. I've made one little tiny adjustment to the pattern. I know when I've made these trousers before, I needed a 14 on the hip here, but then they were a little wide at the bottom for a capri 3/4 length trouser. So there, I fold from there, I've gradually folded the pattern in to get a more tapered leg, and that's where I've used my pins just to hold that double pattern piece over, because if I made them for somebody else, they might not want that. So then I can flap the piece of tissue back out. Glass head pins are great because you can iron and they won't melt. I have melted many a cheap pin. But if you buy these glass head ones, if you ever needed to have those and you were pressing, you could catch them and it wouldn't matter. These scissors are the Janome 2-piece set, and these are the dressmaking scissors off them. I really like them because they're angled, so when you're holding them, you've got this sort of elbow here, and that means that you can have the fabric not lifting off the table so much, but there's room for your hand to move. They're really great. They come in left-handed as well, so if you're a left-handed sewer or you prefer to cut much more neatly with scissors that are left-handed, you could get a pair of those in the same style. So just to review a few cutting tips. So I'm right-handed, I'm cutting with the scissors in my right hand, and I want to have the paper on the left of me because then I'm picking up the whole of this here as a sandwich. If I start cutting on this side, I did just do it to show you, it all sort of peels away and you don't get it to sort of gather the same as a 3-ply sandwich. But if you keep your fabric on the left, it all stays quite together as a sandwich. Great scissors. Okay, don't forget to cut your notches, so you need to be using the tips of the scissors to cut out the notches. So these are going to be for marking the backs and the fronts of the trousers. Tips are sharp too. I keep 2 pairs of scissors. I keep this pair for cutting out cottons, but if I was cutting out something really thick, like 2 layers of Ponte Roma jersey knit or 2 layers of sweatshirt fabric, then I might use another pair, because the thicker the fabrics, the more you're forcing the blades apart. So it's good to have a sort of fine cutting pair and then a thicker cutting pair. You could also try a rotary cutter, but maybe that would be something if you were getting a bit intermediate and you were using lots of different types of fabrics, then you might want to try a rotary cutter as well. So it's time to mark the darts before I take the pattern pieces off, and this is where you'll need some marking tools. And I'm putting this in the beginner's kit recommendation because I really wish I could have one of these when I was a beginner. I bought little chalk pencils, I bought erasing markers, water-soluble pens, Taylor's chalk triangles, and actually I wish I'd had that as an investment right from the start. It's an absolutely brilliant marking tool, and it's a retractable, I hope you can see that, it's a retractable chalk holder. So you put your little chalk in there, and then you've got really good control over it. You can make really small markings, you can draw lines with it, and the chalk is very opaque, but it doesn't brush off really easily. So you can mark out pattern pieces and it doesn't matter if you don't sew it for a couple of days. You also get different coloured chalks so that you can use it on different coloured fabrics. It's really, really great. It comes with a sharpener, so a special one for that width of chalk, and you can sharpen it and get it really, really sharp to a good point, and then it's great for marking through the paper pieces because it's got a point on the end. Here's my little tip for you today. I've got some darts here. I've punctured through some holes, and then I'm using some little reinforcers. You get them from stationers. They're like the little pieces of plastic to put round paper holes, so that where you've punched holes it doesn't rip, but it's really good, and then that stays on the pattern, and then it stops that hole ripping any bigger. But I've got one here, I've got one here, put another one there. I've got the best nails. but it's really, really great. You can mark through the hole then, the hole doesn't get any bigger. And then your marking tool can be used for drawing on that dark line, and you'll see how dark the dot is when I remove the paper. You can see it's a really good dark line, a really good marking that you can very easily see. Here, here and here. I keep all of my tools in a pencil tin. It's actually one from when I was a child. And all my little chalks in there and my pencil sharpener, so that I know that everything's in the tin. That's my marking tool, and I only need one. It's really, really good. I'm not new to this pattern. I've made this pattern before, so I'd already measured my waist using a flexi tape measure. This is a really good one. It's got chunks of colour on it, which is really good, because if you're cutting out on the table, you sort of know which chunk of colour you're looking for. So you were thinking it was 120 something, that's in the red section, and it's got inches on the back. Not all tapes have metric and inches, but I think that's a really good thing to have. And it's really good for measuring yourself and measuring pattern pieces, so that you can check that different. I have to measure that hip measurement always in trousers to check it's going to go round me, and I'm quite short, so I already knew that to measure the crotch to the hem seam would be required for me to work out how long I need my trousers. I very often have to take trousers up a little bit more. So you've got your scissors, you've got pins, you've got a tape measure. There's also a small pair of scissors in with the Janome pack, and that's really good because it makes it really good value. But also it's good to keep these by your sewing machine for snipping threads, or for making little snips in seams, or nipping the corners or clipping the curves. I made a huge mistake last week. I had my big scissors by the desk, and I saw these were on the other table, and I didn't go and get them. And then as I was just snipping the threads on a neck binding, I cut a tiny little hole in the back of my daughter's pyjamas, because I was so busy concentrating on this part of the scissor where I was snipping the threads, that bit just cut a piece of material right on the back. So these are really good. I'm going to make more effort to keep them by the sewing machine, because they're really great for layering seams and all those little jobs where you don't want to be wielding a large pair of scissors. The other little tool that's in the starter kit is a seam gauge, and this one's great. It's multifunctional, so it's got a slide here, which means you can measure a seam allowance edge. So if the seam allowance is 1.5, I can hold that right up close to the fabric, and then I could mark my 1.5 seam allowance all the way along. Really useful if you make collars and you need to make sure that your seam allowance is really accurate so that you get two collars the same. Really great for hemming. You get a straight hem, so you can turn a hem up using this. It's got a point on the end for turning out corners and sort of poking in the corner to get a nice corner, and it's got a little tool on the end for adding button shanks, and I'll show you that another time. And it's not huge, so it's much better than having a piece of tape measure all flapping around or sliding on the floor. It's just really handy because it's really good for close work. You can really use it in an intricate way and an accurate way that means it's very tabletop friendly. So I'm just marking on my dark lines, and there you can see it's a really great marking tool. So if you're new to sewing, this is where I've included this seam gauge as part of a beginner's sewing kit, because if you're new to sewing, you might need to be just giving yourself that extra bit of security and guidance of where your stitch line is. So I've set the little seam gauge to 1.5, I'm using the marking tool just to say I need to have the seam line here, and that gives me this seam allowance here. And if you don't use the right seam allowances, then you won't get the right fit. So if you measured yourself as a 14 and then you use a different seam allowance, then you're not going to get the finished measurement sizes off the pattern. So seam allowances are the bee's knees. You need to have a go at really trying to get the right seam allowance so that you get the right fit, and a seam gauge and a good marking tool are really key to that. So I'm ready to sew. I'm all loaded up with Gutterman thread, an 80 needle from a universal pack. 80 is a size of needle for a thick cotton, which this is because I've got 2 layers. I've got my seam allowance already marked. I've got my pins on a magnet here ready to, so that I can take them out and put them safely away. Let's get sewing. Well, I got sewing on my trousers, sewed the crotch seam and overlocked the edges, and everything was going really, really well. And then I realised that I started to sew up the side seam where I'm putting an invisible zip. And when you put an invisible zip in, you don't sew the side seam. So I'm going to need to use my unpicker. This is a clover unpicker, and I've tried lots of different ones all the time that I've been sewing, but I find this one is the sharpest. It's light. It's easy to manoeuvre, and it's really, really sharp. If you're forcing a seam ripper to cut your stitch threads, then you need to throw it away and get another one. If you're jabbing, then you're going to end up ripping a hole in your fabric. So this one has even just shot through where I went forwards and backwards on the end. So this clover seam ripper is just a really great tool to put in your start sewing, because you will need it. You won't be never unpicking anything. I'm really trying to keep my little sewing scissors by the sewing machine because they're so useful, and they're really good for little intricate work. Like this is the crotch seam, which is on a curve, and I've got to clip the curve, and they're so sharp on the ends. And there I'll get a really smooth curve when I iron that out. So they're really good for having right by the sewing machine. The pins are on a magnet. You can get these from Minerva as well. I find it really useful. Some people have a pin cushion on their hand, but I always seem to get that like stuck through the arm of the sewing machine. I just don't feel free enough with it stuck on my wrist. But a magnet's great because it's such a strong magnet that if you sort of throw a pin near it, it sort of lands in it anyway. They are good, these glass head pins, because they've got the bright coloured tip on the end. You don't lose them. They're not invisible. If they're in the carpet, if they fall on the floor, you can easily pick them up and find them. They're really great. So the trousers I've made today are View D from New Look K6217, a really great pattern for beginners. There's trousers with an invisible zip, 2 darts in the back, so you can adjust the fit on the waist and fit on the hips quite easily. There's a skirt that's the same, so that's got 2 darts in the back and invisible zip. There's a really simple t-shirt top. I make that all of the time, and I'm wearing that t-shirt with those trousers. And I've never made the kimono top. I really need to have a go at that. Maybe that's a little summer thing for me to try. So you could try all of those things when you get your kit together, when you've got your scissors, little sewing trim scissors, seam gauge, pins, marking tool, and of course we have to unpick sometimes. Thanks for watching. If you've got any questions, do ask on the Minerva website, and we can always make tutorials that answer some of your sewing questions.